The October sun slanted through tall windows of the Thornton Manor Library, casting amber light across leather spines and mahogany shelves. Pine Ridge, Montana spread below like a vast canvas of autumn gold, the same view that had greeted sunrise and sunset for 33 years. James William Thornton sat in the worn chair that had once belonged to his father, hands resting on arms polished smooth by decades of use. At 68, his frame still carried the strength of a man who had built an empire with his own hands, though silver now dominated the dark hair at his temples. On the desk before him lay a photograph, edges soft with time. A young woman in a simple dress stood beside a bearded man in rough work clothes. Their faces held that careful stillness people assumed when cameras were rare and precious. But something else lived in that frozen moment. Hope, perhaps, or the quiet knowledge that they stood at the threshold of something larger than themselves. Bootsteps echoed in the hallway. James looked up as his grandson entered 16 years old and carrying the weight of recent history in his eyes. Robert Thornton had returned from the Great War 3 weeks prior, a Purple Heart pinned to his uniform and a scar tracing the line of his jaw. The boy who had left for Europe was gone. The young man who returned had seen things no grandfather could protect against. "You wanted to see me, sir." Robert's voice carried the formal respect of military training. James gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit down, Robert. It's time you heard a story." The young man lowered himself into the seat posture, still parade ground straight. His eyes went to the photograph on the desk, curiosity flickering across his features. "That's Grandmother Emma, isn't it? But who's the man? I've never seen that picture before." James picked up the photograph with careful reverence, the kind of touch reserved for holy relics. "That man is me. 33 years ago, before I became the master of Thornton Ranch, before anyone in Pine Ridge knew my real name, before I understood what it meant to build something worth leaving behind." Robert leaned forward, the stiffness easing from his shoulders. "I don't understand." "You will." James set the photograph down between them. "This ranch, these 60,000 acres, the 8,000 head of cattle grazing our pastures, the $200,000 in assets that will someday be yours. All of it was built on a foundation of secrets and redemption. And if you're going to carry this legacy forward, you need to know how it began." The afternoon light shifted as clouds moved across the Montana sky. James poured 2 glasses of whiskey, sliding one across the desk to his grandson. Robert's eyes widened slightly. His grandfather had never offered him alcohol before. "You're a man now," James said simply. "Men drink whiskey, and men hear hard truths." Robert lifted the glass, waiting. "The story I'm about to tell you," James began, his voice settling into the cadence of memory, "starts in the summer of 1885. I was 35 years old, riding into Pine Ridge territory with 3 things: a Winchester rifle, a Colt revolver, and a leather satchel containing proof that I was the illegitimate son of the most powerful rancher in Montana." Robert's hand froze halfway to his lips. "But before I can tell you about that summer," James continued, "you need to understand what brought me to Montana. You need to know about your great-grandmother, Elizabeth Hayes, the woman who raised me alone in a Colorado mining town, the woman who loved my father and was abandoned by him, the woman who with her dying breath sent me on a journey that would change everything." James took a slow sip of whiskey, letting the burn anchor him to the present, even as his mind traveled back across the decades. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old grief tempered by time into something like wisdom. "Your great-grandmother died in December of 1884. Consumption took her slowly, painfully. I held her hand in that rented room in Denver, listening to her struggle for each breath. And when she could barely whisper, she made me promise something." "What did she promise?" Robert asked quietly. "She made me swear I would find my father, not for money, not for revenge, but so I could look into his eyes and know what kind of man would abandon a woman carrying his child. She wanted me to choose consciously whether to be like him or better than him." James stood, moving to the window. The ranch spread before him like a kingdom, every fence post and barn a testament to choices made long ago. So I came to Montana, and everything that followed, every acre of land you see, every lesson I learned about power and honor and what it means to be a man, it all began with a lie. He turned back to face his grandson. Let me tell you about the summer I met Emma Hartwell. The summer I became James Crawford. The summer I learned that sometimes the greatest fortunes are built not on what we inherit, but on what we choose to become. Robert settled deeper into his chair. Whiskey forgotten, and James began. The Montana sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, relentless and unforgiving. July of 1885 had brought drought to the territory, turning grass brittle and creeks to trickles. The road to Pine Ridge cut through landscape that seemed to stretch forever, empty and vast, in a way that made a man feel both insignificant and free. James Crawford, as he called himself then, rode a sturdy bay mare he'd purchased in Billings. Everything he owned was lashed to the saddle. The Winchester rifle rode in its scabbard, cleaned and oiled. The Colt at his hip carried 6 rounds hammer resting on an empty chamber for safety. These were tools of survival in a land where law existed mostly as a concept and justice often came from the barrel of a gun. But the most important thing he carried sat in the leather satchel tied behind the saddle. Letters written in a woman's careful hand. Photographs that had survived 35 years. A birth certificate bearing 2 names. Elizabeth Hay's mother. William Thornton father. The last hill before Pine Ridge crested and the settlement came into view. Calling it a town would have been generous. 24 buildings clustered along a rutted main street. A general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as schoolhouse on weekdays. And in the distance, dominating the valley like a fortress, the main house of Thornton Ranch. James reined in his horse, studying the ranch with the careful assessment of a military scout surveying enemy territory. Even from miles away, the scale was impressive. Barns larger than most houses, corrals that could hold hundreds of horses, outbuildings scattered across pastures where cattle grazed in numbers too large to count at a glance. This was his father's empire, built on land and cattle and the kind of ruthless business sense that crushed competitors and accumulated wealth like a river gathering strength. Somewhere in that main house lived William Thornton, 65 years old, and master of everything the eye could see. James touched his heels to the mare's flanks and started down the slope. The meeting could wait a few hours. First, he needed to understand the territory, know the people, find the weak points in his father's armor. The road descended through scrub pine and over a narrow creek that barely deserved the name. And it was there, in the meager shade of a struggling cottonwood, that James first saw her. She was bent under the weight of 2 wooden buckets, water sloshing with each labored step. 27, maybe 30 years old, though the sun and hard work had aged her face beyond her years. Her dress was faded calico, mended in a dozen places. Boots worn thin at the soles, hands wrapped around bucket handles, showed calluses thick as leather. But what struck James most was the set of her shoulders. Bowed under the weight, yes, but straight beneath the burden. There was dignity in her struggle, a kind of quiet strength that spoke of years spent carrying loads no one else would bear. He was going to ride past. This wasn't his concern. He had come to Montana for one purpose, and helping strange women with water buckets wasn't part of the plan. Then she stumbled. Not a fall, just a momentary loss of balance as her boot caught a rock. Water splashed from the buckets. She stopped setting them down with a small sound that might have been pain or frustration or both. Her hands came up, fingers working the spots where handles had cut into palms. James saw blood. Before conscious thought caught up with instinct, he was dismounting. The mare's reins wrapped around a branch, his boots hitting hard-packed earth. 3 strides closed the distance between them. "Morning, ma'am." His voice came out rougher than intended, rusty from days of silence on the trail. "Those buckets look heavy." She jumped like a startled deer, spinning to face him. Fear flashed across her features. Not the healthy caution a woman alone might show to a strange man. This was something deeper. Learned. the kind of fear that came from too many harsh words and harder hands. "I can manage, sir." She kept her eyes down, voice barely above a whisper. James had already reached for the buckets. Up close he could see the cuts on her palms more clearly. Fresh blood mixed with older scars. This woman had been carrying water for a long time. "I'm sure you can," he said, lifting the buckets with an ease that demonstrated the strength in his arms. "But you don't have to. Where are you headed?" "The settlement, sir." She gestured vaguely toward the cluster of buildings. "I live there." "Then I'll walk with you." She opened her mouth probably to protest again, then closed it. Something in his tone perhaps told her the decision was already made, or maybe she was just too tired to argue. Either way, she started walking, and James fell into step beside her. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of bucket handles and the soft scuff of boots on dirt. James studied her from the corner of his eye. There was something familiar in her bearing, not in the sense of having met her before, but in the way she moved through the world, small, trying not to take up space, apologizing with her posture for the simple act of existing. His mother had moved like that in the early years, before she found her strength, before she learned that survival meant standing tall even when the world pressed down. "I'm James Crawford," he said, breaking the silence. "New foreman at Thornton Ranch." That got her attention. She glanced up, surprise flickering across features made plain by hardship, but not unattractive. Brown eyes held intelligence that education had never had the chance to polish. Her mouth, pressed thin by years of holding back words, softened slightly. "Mr. Thornton hired a new foreman. He's very particular about his staff." "So I've heard." James shifted the buckets, redistributing weight. "Let's say we have history." It wasn't quite a lie. They did have history, just not the kind she would imagine. They walked on. James let the conversation lapse again, but this time the silence felt more comfortable. Less like two strangers forced together, more like two people sharing a road. The settlement drew closer. James could make out details now. The general store's peeling paint, horses tied at the saloon hitching post, a woman sweeping the porch of what might have been a boarding house, pausing to stare as they approached. "What's your name?" James asked. Another hesitation, like she wasn't used to people asking or caring about the answer. "Emma," she said finally. "Emma Hartwell." "Well, Miss Emma Hartwell, which cabin is yours?" She pointed to a structure at the edge of the settlement. Calling it a cabin was generous. It was more of a shack, logs chinked with mud that had cracked in the summer heat, a roof of wooden shakes missing enough pieces to make rain a serious concern, one window covered with oiled paper instead of glass. James carried the buckets to the door, set them down carefully to avoid splashing more water. When he straightened, Emma was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Confusion, maybe, suspicion, a hint of something that might have been hope quickly tamped down like a dangerous fire. "Thank you," she said, "for the help." "It was my pleasure, Miss Hartwell." He meant it. There was something about her quiet dignity that demanded respect. "Perhaps our paths will cross again." "Perhaps," she agreed, though her tone suggested she thought it unlikely. James tipped his hat, mounted his mare, and rode toward the Thornton Ranch. But as he crested the next rise, he looked back. Emma stood in her doorway, one hand shading her eyes, watching him go. Even from that distance, he could sense her confusion. He understood. Acts of kindness were clearly rare in her world. James turned his horse toward Destiny and spurred into a canter. Behind him, Emma Hartwell remained in the doorway, something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. She didn't have a name for it yet, but in time she would call it hope. The main house of Thornton Ranch rose like a monument to ambition. 2 stories of timber and stone with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Glass windows, a luxury in the territory, caught the afternoon sun and threw it back in brilliant shards. Chimneys at either end promised fireplaces large enough to heat rooms through Montana's brutal winters. James dismounted at the hitching post, taking his time to secure the mare. His hands moved with the automatic precision of long practice, but his mind was cataloging details. The quality of the lumber in the barn, the condition of the fences, the way workers moved about their tasks with the efficiency that spoke of good management and fair treatment. Whatever else William Thornton might be, he ran a tight operation. The front door opened before James reached the porch. A man emerged, weathered and competent, wearing the practical clothes of a working ranch hand. His eyes did a quick assessment. Armed stranger. Travel-worn, but not destitute. Carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to respect. Help you. The question was neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. James Crawford, I'm expected. Recognition flickered. The new foreman. Mr. Thornton's in his office, I'll show you. The interior of the house matched the exterior's promise. Hardwood floors polished to a soft gleam. Furniture that had been shipped from back east at considerable expense. Books lining shelves in a room glimpsed through an open door. This wasn't just wealth. This was culture, education, the kind of life Elizabeth Hayes might have had if William Thornton had possessed the courage to choose love over legacy. James felt anger tighten his chest, forced it down. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not yet. The ranch hand knocked on a door at the end of the hall. Mr. Thornton, James Crawford is here. Send him in. The voice came muffled through thick wood, but James heard it clearly. Deep, authoritative, accustomed to being obeyed. His father's voice. James entered the office. It was a working room, not a showplace. A massive desk dominated the center, covered with ledgers and papers organized into neat stacks. Maps hung on walls, showing property lines and water rights. A gun rack held rifles cleaned and oiled to perfection. The window behind the desk framed a view of the ranch that made the strategic purpose clear. From here, William Thornton could literally overlook his domain. The man himself sat behind the desk, not bothering to look up from the ledger he was reviewing. 65 years old, hair more silver than dark, shoulders still broad despite age. Strong hands held a pen with the same confidence they might hold a branding iron or a rifle. James stood silent, waiting. Let his father make the first move. See what kind of man assumed an employee would simply stand there ignored. The silence stretched. William Thornton made a notation in the ledger, turned a page, made another mark. Finally, without looking up, he spoke. Martinez recommended you. Said you know cattle and can handle men. That true? Yes, sir. Wages are $80 a month. You'll live in the foreman's cabin. Meals with the hands in the bunkhouse. You report to me directly. Any questions? Just one. Now William looked up and froze. Whatever he had been about to say died on his lips. The pen slipped from fingers, suddenly nerveless, rolling across the desk and falling to the floor with a small clatter that sounded loud in the sudden silence. James stood perfectly still, letting his father look. See the resemblance that no amount of time or distance could erase. The same jawline, the same height, the same eyes, gray-blue like winter sky over mountains. William Thornton was looking at his own face, aged back 30 years. Elizabeth. The name came out as barely more than a whisper. James reached for the leather satchel he'd brought with him, set it on the desk between them with deliberate care, opened it and withdrew the contents. Letters tied with faded ribbon, photographs preserved in frames of cheap wood, a birth certificate, the paper yellowed, but the ink still clear. William picked up the first photograph with shaking hands. A young woman, perhaps 19, stood in front of a photography studio in Denver. Her dress was simple but clean. Her face held the kind of beauty that came from hope and youth and believing the world might be kind. She kept these, James said, his voice level despite the emotion roiling in his gut. Every letter you sent in the first year before they stopped coming. Every promise you made about sending for her, about making things right. William set the photograph down like it burned his fingers, picked up the next one. This showed a young man standing beside the same young woman. The man was clearly a younger version of William himself. The resemblance was unmistakable. When did she... William couldn't finish the question. December. Last year. Consumption. It took her slowly. James heard his own voice go hard. She died in a rented room in Denver because she couldn't afford a doctor. The woman you promised to marry, the mother of your son. She died alone except for me coughing blood into rags we couldn't afford to replace." William's face had gone gray. He stood slowly like an old man despite his still vigorous frame, moved to the window without speaking, staring out at land and cattle and wealth that could have saved Elizabeth Hayes if pride and fear hadn't stood in the way. "My father found out," William said finally, voice rough, "about Elizabeth, about the pregnancy. He gave me a choice: marry her and be disinherited, or send her away with money and keep my inheritance. And you chose the money." "I chose like a coward." William turned from the window, and James saw tears in his eyes. In a man of this generation in this hard country, tears were a seismic event. "I told myself she'd understand, that I'd make it right later, that money could fix anything. I was 23 years old and stupid in ways that can't be forgiven." "She forgave you," James said. The words tasted like ash. "She spent 35 years forgiving you. Every night she told me about William Thornton, not with bitterness, with sadness, like you were someone who had died young before becoming the man you could have been." William returned to his chair, sat heavily, picked up each piece of evidence James had brought: the letters, the photographs, finally the birth certificate. "James William Thornton," he read aloud. "Born March 15, 1850, Denver, Colorado Territory. Mother Elizabeth Hayes. Father—" He stopped. "Father William Thornton," James finished. "She gave me your name, not as a claim, as a reminder that I had a choice to make. Would I become the kind of man who abandoned his responsibilities, or something better?" The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack the floorboards. Outside, ranch sounds continued: horses whinnying, men calling to each other, the normal business of a working operation. But inside this office, two men faced a reckoning 35 years in the making. William Thornton opened a drawer in his desk, withdrew a small wooden box, opened it to reveal a stack of papers. He selected one, unfolded it, and placed it where James could see. It was a letter, addressed to Elizabeth Hayes in Denver, dated 1851, the year after James's birth. The seal had never been broken. "I wrote to her," William said quietly. "Sent 20 letters over 5 years. Every one came back marked addressee unknown. I hired detectives, searched every city between here and California. She'd vanished. I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I hoped she'd found someone better than me, someone who would give her the life she deserved." James picked up the letter, saw his father's handwriting, young and uncertain, felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a crack in the armor of righteous anger he'd worn for so long. "She moved constantly," James said. "Different cities, different names sometimes, not hiding from you exactly, just trying to stay ahead of the shame. An unmarried mother with a child. There weren't many places that would accept that." William nodded slowly. "And now she's gone, and I never had the chance to tell her." He couldn't finish. "Tell her what? That she was the only woman I ever loved, that not a day passed when I didn't think of her, that I built all of this." He gestured to encompass the ranch, the wealth, the empire. "And it meant nothing because the one thing I wanted I'd thrown away with both hands." James had come to Montana expecting many things: anger, denial, perhaps an attempt to buy his silence. He had not expected this. Genuine grief, real remorse, the broken pieces of a man who had made a terrible choice and spent decades living with the consequences. It didn't change the past, but it complicated the present in ways James hadn't anticipated. William stood again. This time he opened a cabinet and withdrew a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses, poured generous measures into each, slid one across the desk to James. "A toast," William said, raising his glass, "to Elizabeth Hayes, the best woman either of us will ever know." James lifted his own glass. They drank in silence. When the glasses were empty, William refilled them, but instead of drinking, he set his down and met James's eyes directly. "I'm dying," he said simply. "Heart disease. Doctor from Denver gave me a year, maybe less." The words hit like a physical blow. James had imagined this confrontation 1,000 times during the ride from Colorado. In his imagination there had been time to know this man, time to decide whether forgiveness was possible, time to extract every answer to every question that had haunted his childhood. Now time that precious commodity was in short supply. "I have no children," William continued, "no wife. Edward, my cousin, assumes he'll inherit everything when I die. He's a snake who'll tear down everything I built and sell it piece by piece to pay gambling debts." He opened another drawer, withdrew a document thick with legal language and official seals. "This is my will, written 6 months ago when the doctors confirmed what I already suspected. It names you, James William Thornton, as my sole heir, legitimate son acknowledged and claimed. Everything I own becomes yours when I die." James stared at the document. At the bottom he could see signatures: William Thornton, 3 witnesses, a notary seal. "Why?" The question came out harsh. "You didn't acknowledge me for 35 years. Why now?" "Because it's the right thing to do. And because—" William paused, took a slow breath. "Because I want the chance to know my son before I die, to see what kind of man Elizabeth raised, to maybe, if I'm very lucky, earn something that looks like forgiveness. I don't forgive you. I know. I don't expect you to." William's voice remained steady. "But I'm asking you to stay, work as foreman, learn the business. Let me teach you how to run this ranch, and when I'm gone, decide for yourself whether to keep it or burn it to the ground. Either way, you'll have the choice I never gave your mother." James looked at the will, at the maps on the walls showing property that stretched farther than a man could ride in a day, at his father, silver-haired and dying, asking for something that might or might not be possible. The smart play would be to refuse. Take the moral high ground. Let William Thornton die knowing his son had rejected him the way he'd rejected Elizabeth Hayes. But James had spent his whole life hearing about this man, wondering what kind of coward abandoned a woman he claimed to love. Angry at a father who existed only as an absence, a hole in the shape of what should have been. Now, unexpectedly, he had the chance for answers, for understanding, if not forgiveness, and perhaps, just perhaps, the chance to transform something born of cowardice into something that could honor his mother's memory. "I'll stay," James heard himself say, "but on one condition." "Name it." "No one knows I'm your son until after you die. I'll work as James Crawford foreman, hired on merit. If I can't run this ranch successfully, I don't deserve to inherit it. Blood alone isn't enough." William studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "Agreed. You'll earn your place through competence, not birthright." He extended his hand across the desk. "Welcome to Thornton Ranch, Mr. Crawford." James shook his father's hand. The grip was still strong despite the failing heart. Strong enough to have held on to Elizabeth Hayes if courage had matched strength. But that was 35 years in the past, and the future, for however long it lasted, started now. 4 weeks had passed since the wedding. 4 weeks of learning what it meant to build a life beside someone rather than simply existing in parallel. The cabin James had prepared stood at the edge of the ranch property, close enough to the main operations for convenience, far enough for privacy. 2 rooms that had seemed adequate for a bachelor felt almost spacious now that they held purpose beyond mere shelter. Emma rose before dawn each morning, a habit formed by years of hauling water in darkness to avoid the heat of day. But now she moved through their small domain with quiet efficiency, building up the fire in the cast-iron stove, preparing breakfast while James dressed for the day's work. Coffee boiled in a blue enamel pot. Bacon sizzled in the pan. Biscuits rose in the oven, filling the cabin with scents that spoke of home rather than just habitation. James sat at the table he'd built with his own hands, reviewing notes he'd made the previous evening. Ranch operations required constant attention. Fence lines to check, cattle to rotate between pastures, workers to supervise. 1,000 details that separated a well-run operation from one sliding toward chaos. Emma set a plate before him. Their fingers brushed a contact that still carried the electric charge of newness. She pulled back slightly, color rising in her cheeks, and James felt something warm settle in his chest. This woman, who had been told her entire life that she was worthless, was learning slowly that touch could be gentle rather than harsh. "The north fence posts are rotting," Emma said, pouring coffee into his cup. "I saw them yesterday when I walked to town. They'll need replacing before winter." James looked up surprised. Most women of the territory concerned themselves solely with domestic matters, leaving ranch operations entirely to their husbands. But Emma had good eyes and a practical mind. She saw problems and thought in terms of solutions. "Good catch," he said. "I'll check them today. How many posts do you estimate?" 15, maybe 20. The wet spring weakened them." James made a note. Emma sat across from him with her own plate, but he noticed she ate slowly, watching him. Not with fear or subservience, with something closer to wonder, as if she still couldn't quite believe this life was real. They ate in comfortable silence, punctuated only by the crackle of fire and the distant sounds of the ranch waking up. Men calling to each other, horses moving in the corrals, the rhythm of a working operation gearing up for another day. "I thought I might start a vegetable garden behind the cabin," Emma said after a while. "There's good soil there. With winter coming, we could put up preserves." "Good idea. We can spare the space and the water." James finished his coffee. "If you need seeds or tools, put it on the ranch account at the general store." Emma's eyes widened. "I couldn't. That's too much." "You're my wife. What's mine is yours. That includes the ranch account." He stood gathering his hat. "Besides, a garden is an investment. Food we grow is food we don't have to buy." He bent to kiss her forehead, a gesture that had become habit over the past weeks. Emma closed her eyes, accepting the affection with an expression that made James's chest tighten. How many years had she gone without tenderness? How long had she believed herself unworthy of basic kindness? The door closed behind him. Emma sat for a moment in the quiet cabin, hand touching the spot where his lips had pressed against her skin. Then she stood, cleared the dishes, and began planning her garden. She had learned these past weeks that happiness required active participation. It wasn't something that simply happened to you. It was something you built day by day, choice by choice. Outside, James walked toward the main barn where the day's assignments would be distributed. The morning air carried autumn's first hints, a crispness that promised winter would come early this year. He made mental notes as he walked. Extra hay needed to be cut and stored. Storm shelters checked and reinforced. Firewood split and stacked. Rodriguez met him at the barn, the Mexican hand, who had proven himself reliable and competent. "Morning, boss. Got the crew ready for fence repair detail." "Good man. Take Murphy and Thompson. Start on the north section. Emma spotted rot in the posts there." Rodriguez nodded, respect clear in his eyes. In a month, James had earned what some foremen couldn't achieve in years. He worked harder than anyone he supervised, made decisions that were fair rather than convenient, paid promised wages on time and in full. Small things, perhaps. But in the hard world of ranch work, small things mattered. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of labor. James rode fence lines, checking for breaks, supervised the rotation of cattle to fresh pasture, stopped a potential fight between two hands who'd gotten into a dispute over cards the night before. By noon, his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cooling weather. He was returning to the main barn when he saw the rider approaching from the direction of the main house, not one of the regular hands. Someone moving with the purposeful speed of carrying urgent news. The rider was young, barely 20, employed at the main house rather than on range work. He reined in his horse hard, breathing heavy. "Mr. Crawford, you need to come quick. Mr. Thornton collapsed." James felt his blood turn to ice. "When?" 20 minutes ago. Dr. Harrison's with him now, but it's bad, real bad." James was already swinging into his saddle. The ride to the main house took minutes that felt like hours. He found organized chaos, workers standing in uncertain clusters, the housekeeper wringing her hands on the porch, and through the open door of William's bedroom he could hear the doctor's calm voice giving instructions. James dismounted, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. No one tried to stop him. In the month since his arrival, everyone had noticed that William Thornton treated his new foreman differently, with respect that bordered on affection. Conversations that went on longer than mere business required, a relationship that defied easy explanation, if they only knew. Dr. Harrison looked up as James entered the bedroom. The doctor was a competent man in his 50s, trained in Philadelphia before the lure of the frontier had brought him west. He recognized James immediately and stepped aside, allowing access to the bed. William Thornton lay against pillows that seemed too white, too clean for the graying face they supported. His breathing came shallow and rapid. One hand clutched at his chest, fingers curled like claws. But his eyes were clear when they found James. "Wondered how long before you showed up," William said, voice thin but steady. "What happened?" James moved to the bedside, careful to keep his expression appropriate for a concerned employee rather than a terrified son. "His heart," Dr. Harrison said quietly. "I've warned him for months. The strain is too much. He needs complete rest, no work, no stress." "I'm not resting in bed while the ranch falls apart," William said. "The ranch won't fall apart." James kept his voice level despite the fear crawling up his spine. "I can handle operations." "I know you can. That's not what worries me." William's gaze moved to the doctor. "Give us a minute. Alone." Dr. Harrison hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. Then you rest or I'll sedate you myself." The door closed. James pulled a chair close to the bed, acutely aware that this might be one of the last conversations he had with his father. 1 month. They'd had 1 month together. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. "I need to update the will," William said. "Make it official. You as primary beneficiary. You're not dying today. There's time." "There isn't." William's hand shot out, gripping James's wrist with surprising strength. "I can feel it. The doctor's being kind, but I know. Weeks, maybe. Not months." James felt something break inside his chest. He'd spent 35 years hating this man, blaming him for every hardship Elizabeth had endured. And now, when he'd finally gotten the chance to know William Thornton as a person rather than an absence, time was running out. "I'm not ready," James heard himself say. The admission felt like weakness, but the words came anyway. "I don't know enough about the business, the connections, the political arrangements." "You know enough, and what you don't know you'll figure out. You're smart like your mother." William's grip loosened, hand falling back to the bed. "But James, you need to be careful. Edward knows I'm sick. He's already making moves." "What kind of moves?" "Borrowing money against expected inheritance. Making promises to creditors. Positioning himself as my heir." William's breathing had grown more labored. "When I die, he'll contest the will. He'll claim you're a fraud, that I was senile or manipulated. You need to be ready for that fight." "I will be. And you need to tell Emma, soon, before she hears it from someone else." James had been dreading this conversation. Emma deserved the truth. But every day that passed made the lie bigger, more consequential, harder to explain. "I'll tell her. After. When the will is read and there's no going back." "That's the coward's way." William's eyes held disappointment. "I know because I took it. I waited to tell my father about Elizabeth until she was already carrying you. By then it was too late for honesty. Only damage control." The words hit like a fist. James wanted to argue, to insist this was different. But William was right. Keeping secrets, even with good intentions, was still cowardice. And cowardice had cost William everything that mattered. "I don't want to lose her," James admitted. "Then don't be like me. Tell her the truth and trust that what you've built together can survive it." William closed his eyes, exhaustion winning the battle against will. "Learn from my mistakes, son. That's the only value they have." Dr. Harrison returned gently but firmly, ushering James out. "He needs rest now. You can visit tomorrow if he's stronger." James left the main house feeling like he'd aged a decade in an hour. The afternoon sun seemed too bright, the ranch sounds too normal. Somewhere in that house his father was dying. And James wasn't ready, wasn't prepared for the weight that was about to descend on his shoulders. He rode back toward his cabin, mind churning. But before he reached home, he was intercepted by Rodriguez. "Boss, we got a problem. Someone's been cutting fences on the East Range. Looks deliberate." James pushed personal concerns aside. The ranch needed him. Grief and fear would have to wait. "Show me," he said. They rode east where the Thornton property bordered unclaimed territory that was slowly being settled by smaller operations. The fence line showed clear evidence of sabotage, clean cuts through wire, posts deliberately loosened, and worse, cattle prints leading away from Thornton land. "Rustlers," Rodriguez said. "Third time this month." "You think it's Cornelius Drake?" James asked, naming the neighboring rancher who'd been pushing boundaries since before James arrived. "Drake or someone he hired. He's been talking around town about how Thornton's too old to protect his interests, how the ranch is weak." James studied the fence line, calculating. This wasn't random theft. It was probing, testing defenses, seeing how far they could push before meeting resistance. "Double the patrols tonight," James said. "Tell the men to go armed." And Rodriguez passed the word. "We're not looking to kill anyone, but we will defend what's ours. Anyone caught cutting fence or driving our cattle gets one warning. After that we shoot." Rodriguez grinned. "About time. The men have been getting restless. We know how to handle rustlers." That night James joined the patrol himself. 6 men on horseback spread across the most vulnerable sections of fence line. The moon was near full, providing enough light to see by while still leaving shadows for concealment. They waited. Midnight passed. Then 1 in the morning. James was starting to think the rustlers had moved to a different section when he heard it. The soft nicker of horses moving slowly. Men's voices deliberately quiet but carrying in the still night air. James signaled his men. They spread out, approaching from 3 sides. Through the fence line, James could see shapes. 12 men, maybe more. They worked with practiced efficiency, cutting wire and driving a small herd of Thornton cattle through the gap. Professional thieves. Not desperate homesteaders stealing 1 cow for food. This was organized crime backed by money and planning. James waited until the thieves were committed. Half the cattle through the fence, the men fully focused on their work. Then he stood in his stirrups, Winchester rifle aimed at the sky. The shot echoed across the empty land like thunder. "Drop your weapons. You're surrounded." For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then chaos erupted. Some rustlers reached for guns, others dove for cover. Horses screamed and plunged. The stolen cattle scattered in panic. James didn't want a massacre, but he needed to make a point. He aimed for the lead rustler's horse, putting a round into the ground inches from its hooves. The animal reared, throwing its rider. Before the man could recover, Rodriguez was there with a rope lassoing him like a steer. Gunfire crackled across the darkness. James saw muzzle flashes, heard bullets whine past. He dropped from his horse, using the animal's body as cover while he worked the Winchester's lever action. Aimed. Fired. A rustler screamed, going down with a leg wound. The fight lasted minutes, but felt eternal. When it ended, 3 rustlers were captured. 2 were wounded non-fatally. The rest had scattered into the darkness, leaving behind the stolen cattle and their fallen companions. James approached the captured leader, a man in his 40s, with the look of someone who'd spent years on the wrong side of the law. "Who hired you?" The rustler spat blood. "Go to hell." James cocked the Winchester, pressing the barrel against the man's kneecap. "Last chance. Who hired you?" Fear flickered in the rustler's eyes. These weren't men accustomed to real consequences. They expected to steal, maybe exchange a few shots, and ride away into the night. Actual accountability was foreign territory. "Drake," the rustler said finally. "Cornelius Drake. Pays $50 per head we deliver. And someone else, another man, paying extra." The rustler hesitated. James pressed the rifle harder. "Eastern gentleman," the rustler gasped. "Didn't get a name, but he paid $200 extra if we caused maximum damage. Stampede the herd. Burn buildings. Make Thornton Ranch look weak." James stepped back, lowering the rifle. Edward. It had to be, trying to devalue the ranch before he inherited it, or trying to make James look incompetent as foreman, maybe both. Rodriguez, take these men to the sheriff in town, file charges for cattle theft and armed trespass. Tell Sheriff Morgan I want them prosecuted to the full extent of territorial law. Yes, boss. James watched the prisoners being tied and loaded onto horses. Around him his men moved with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. They'd defended their territory, proven that Thornton Ranch wasn't weak regardless of William's failing health. But as James rode back toward the main house to report the incident, he felt the weight of what was coming. Edward wasn't going to stop with hired rustlers. The real battle, the one that would determine who controlled this empire, hadn't even begun yet. And when it came, James would need more than a Winchester rifle to win. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity and dread. William's health continued to decline despite Dr. Harrison's best efforts. The old rancher spent most days in bed now, strength fading like snow in spring sunshine. James visited daily ostensibly to report on ranch operations, but really just to be present, to extract whatever wisdom and knowledge he could from a man who wouldn't be around to share it much longer. Emma noticed the toll it took. She said nothing directly, but her care became more attentive. Hot meals waiting when he returned from long days, coffee ready before dawn, small gestures that spoke of understanding, even if she didn't know the full story. And then, on a cold November morning, with frost turning the grass silver, Dr. Harrison sent word. If James wanted to see William Thornton alive, he should come immediately. James found his father propped against pillows, skin the color of old parchment, but his eyes were clear, alert, focused with the intensity of a man who knew his time was measured in hours. "Close the door," William said. His voice was barely a whisper, but the command in it remained. "I need to tell you some things, and I need you to listen without interrupting." James closed the door, pulled the chair close, prepared himself for whatever last words his father needed to say. "I loved your mother," William began. "I want you to understand that. It wasn't a youthful mistake or a moment of weakness. I loved Elizabeth Hayes with everything I had, and I was too much of a coward to choose her over this." He gestured weakly at the room, the house, the ranch beyond. "I know." "Do you?" "Because I need you to really understand. The ranch, the money, the power, all of it is meaningless if you don't have someone to share it with. Someone who loves you for who you are, not what you own." William's breathing had become labored. "You have that with Emma. Don't make my mistake. Don't let secrets and pride destroy what you're building." "I'll tell her, soon. Tell her today, before I'm gone and she learns it from strangers at the will reading." William reached out, finding James's hand. "Promise me." "I promise." William's grip loosened. His eyes drifted closed, then opened again with effort. "The lawyer is coming this afternoon. 3 witnesses with him. Everything is prepared. The will names you as my son and sole heir. Edward gets $5,000, enough to start fresh somewhere else, not enough to contest. He'll contest anyway. Of course he will. He's already borrowed against the inheritance, $35,000 from San Francisco banks." A ghost of a smile touched William's lips. "I made sure you'd know. Use that knowledge when the time comes." "How did you—" "I'm dying, not stupid. I've spent the last month preparing for the battle you'll face after I'm gone. Documentation, witnesses, evidence that will stand up in any court." William's voice was fading. "But James, the most important thing isn't legal preparation. It's moral authority. You need to be the man who deserves this ranch, not because of blood, because of character." "I'll try." "Don't try. Do." William's hand went limp in James's grasp. "And James, one more thing. Forgive me. Not for my sake. For yours. Anger is a burden you don't need to carry." James felt tears sting his eyes. For 35 years he'd imagined this moment, confronting his father, making him pay for abandoning Elizabeth, extracting some measure of justice for all the years of hardship and struggle. But sitting here holding the hand of a dying man who was trying in his last hours to make amends, James found that revenge tasted like ashes. "I forgive you," he said, and meant it. William Thornton smiled. "Elizabeth raised a good man. I'm proud to call you my son." Those were his last words. His breathing slowed, steadied, and then, with a final small exhalation, stopped entirely. James sat for a long time holding his father's hand as it cooled. 35 years of anger and resentment, 1 month of actual acquaintance, and now this ending. It seemed inadequate, insufficient, but it was what they had. Finally he stood, gently arranged William's hands across his chest, pulled the sheet up to cover the face that had looked so much like his own, and went to inform the household that William Thornton, master of the greatest ranch in Montana Territory, had passed away. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of arrangements and obligations, the body prepared, notices sent to distant relatives, the ranch continuing its operations because cattle didn't stop needing care just because their owner had died. James moved through it all in a fog, aware that he was being watched, evaluated. People noticed that the new foreman seemed to take William's death harder than a mere employee should. Let them notice. Soon enough, they'd know why. The will reading was scheduled for November 12th, 4 days after William's death. The main house library was crowded with people who'd made the journey from across the territory. Distant cousins who'd never visited when William was alive. Business associates smelling opportunity. And prominently, Edward Thornton. James had never met Edward before, though William had described him accurately. 42 years old, dressed in expensive suits from San Francisco, carrying himself with the arrogance of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He looked at James with barely concealed contempt, just another ranch hand soon to be looking for new employment now that the old man was gone. Emma sat beside James, confused by the formality of it all. Why did a foreman need to attend the will reading? James had explained that William had left him something, a small bequest, perhaps in recognition of good work. She'd accepted the explanation, though he could see questions in her eyes. The lawyer, Samuel Price from Helena, called the room to order. He was a serious man in his 50s, with the careful precision of someone accustomed to dealing with large sums of money and the conflicts they generated. "We are gathered for the reading of the last will and testament of William Thornton, deceased. The will was properly executed on May 1st, 1885, in the presence of 3 witnesses and duly notarized." Edward leaned forward, eager. Samuel began reading. The preliminary bequests came first. $1,000 to the church, $500 each to longtime employees, personal items distributed to old friends, standard provisions that surprised no one. Then Samuel's voice took on a different tone. "To my cousin Edward Thornton, I bequeath the sum of $5,000 with the understanding that this settles all familial obligations and expectations." Edward's face went red. "5,000. That's an insult." "Please hold your comments until the reading is complete," Samuel said calmly. "The entirety of my estate, including all lands, livestock, buildings, equipment, and financial assets currently valued at approximately $150,000, I leave to my son." The room erupted. Everyone talking at once. Edward on his feet shouting. Distant relatives exchanging shocked glances. Through it all, Emma sat frozen, her hand still clasped in James's. "Son." Edward's voice cut through the chaos. William had no son. Samuel waited for the noise to subside. Then in the silence that followed, he continued reading. "James William Thornton, born to Elizabeth Hayes on March 15, 1850, in Denver, Colorado Territory." Every eye in the room turned to James. He felt Emma's hand go limp in his, saw the color drain from her face as comprehension dawned. "I hereby acknowledge James as my legitimate son," Samuel read. "Enclosed with this will are the following supporting documents: birth certificate listing William Thornton as father, letters from Elizabeth Hayes documenting our relationship, photographs from 1849 through 1850, and a formal paternity acknowledgement signed on May 1st, 1885, before 3 witnesses and a notary." Edward was shouting now, but James barely heard him. All his attention was on Emma. She was staring at him like he'd become a stranger, betrayal written across every line of her face. "James William Thornton," she whispered, "not Crawford." "Emma, let me explain." But she pulled her hand away, stood abruptly, the scrape of her chair cutting through Edward's rant. "Emma, please." She looked at him with eyes that held tears and fury in equal measure. "How long have you known? Since before we met." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Emma nodded slowly as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. Then, without another word, she walked out of the library. James started to follow, but Samuel's voice stopped him. "Mr. Thornton, we need to complete the reading." James sat back down, feeling like he'd been gutted. Around him the chaos continued. Edward demanding to see the documents, relatives arguing about legitimacy and inheritance law, Samuel Price calmly producing evidence, laying it out for inspection. The birth certificate yellowed but clear. Photographs showing William as a young man with Elizabeth, letters in Elizabeth's careful hand. And most damning of all, the formal acknowledgment signed by William, witnessed by Judge Robert Mitchell, Dr. Harrison, and the town's leading banker. "This is fraud," Edward declared. "My cousin was clearly not of sound mind in his final months. He was manipulated." "I was one of the witnesses," Judge Mitchell said quietly. The elderly jurist had come down from Helena specifically for this. William Thornton was entirely lucid when he signed that document. He explained his reasoning clearly and in detail. His mental competency is beyond question. Then he was coerced. This pretender showed up out of nowhere. "With documented proof of paternity," Samuel interrupted, "which has been verified by multiple sources. Unless you have evidence of fraud, Mr. Edward Thornton, I suggest you accept the will's provisions." Edward's face had gone purple. "I'll contest this in every court from here to Washington. Illegitimate children have no rights." Montana Territorial Law of 1884 explicitly allows fathers to acknowledge and provide for children born outside marriage, Samuel said. "The law is quite clear on this point." The fight continued for another hour, but the conclusion was inevitable. The will was legal, the acknowledgment valid. James William Thornton was now the owner of the largest ranch in the territory, and he'd just lost the only thing that mattered more than all of it combined. When the reading finally concluded and the library emptied, James sat alone in the growing darkness. Through the window he could see the ranch spreading into twilight. 50,000 acres, thousands of cattle, buildings and equipment worth a fortune. His father's empire built over decades of hard work and ruthless business sense. All of it meant nothing if Emma was gone. He found her back at their cabin, packing her few belongings into a worn carpet bag. She moved with mechanical efficiency, face set in lines of determination. "Emma, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" She didn't look at him. "That you lied about who you were, that you married me under false pretenses, that every moment we spent together was built on deception." "It wasn't like that. I never lied about my feelings for you." Now she did look at him, tears streaking her face. "You let me believe you were a poor foreman. You let me marry James Crawford. But he doesn't exist, does he? There's only James Thornton, heir to a fortune, who needed a wife who wouldn't ask questions. That's not fair. I married you because I fell in love with you. When were you planning to tell me the truth? Before or after I became Mrs. Thornton without even knowing it?" James had no good answer. He'd told himself he was protecting her, that revealing the truth too soon might make her feel obligated, that he wanted her to choose him for himself, not for what he'd inherit. But standing here, seeing the pain in her eyes, all those justifications turned to dust. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that if you knew you'd think I was just using you, or that you'd feel obligated to stay because of the money. I wanted you to choose me, just me, not the ranch or the inheritance." Emma sat heavily on the bed they'd shared. "Do you understand what you've done? My entire life people told me I was worthless, that I should be grateful for any scrap of attention, that I was lucky if anyone would take me." She looked up at him with eyes that broke his heart. "Then you came along. You treated me like I mattered, like I was worth something beyond being a burden or a convenience, and I started to believe it, started to think maybe I did have value." Her voice cracked, but it was all based on a lie. "How do I know any of it was real?" James knelt before her, desperate to make her understand. "Every moment was real. When I helped you with the water buckets, that was real. When I built that well, that was real. When I taught you to read in the evenings, that was real. The man you fell in love with, that was me, not a pretense, not a role, me. But you kept secrets, huge life-changing secrets. How can I trust anything now? I don't know. I only know that I love you, that losing you would hurt worse than losing all of this combined." He gestured at the cabin, the ranch beyond. "Emma, if you want to leave, I'll go with you. We'll walk away from the inheritance. Start over somewhere else with nothing. I don't care about the ranch. I care about you." She stared at him for a long time. James held his breath, aware that his entire future balanced on what she said next. "You'd give up $150,000 for me? In a heartbeat. You're worth more than any amount of money." "How do I know you mean that?" "Because I'm saying it now when you're angry and I'm terrified, when honesty is all I have left to offer." James took her hands, feeling her try to pull away, then relent. "Emma, I made a terrible mistake. I kept the truth from you out of fear and cowardice. But the man who made that mistake is the same man who loves you, who wants to build a life with you, who needs you more than he's ever needed anything." Emma's tears flowed freely now. "I don't know if I can trust you again." "Then I'll spend every day proving I'm worth trusting, for as long as it takes." She pulled her hands free, standing and moving to the window. Outside, darkness had fallen completely. The ranch lay invisible, except for scattered lights from buildings where workers bedded down for the night. "I need time," she said finally, "to think, to understand what all of this means, who I even am now. Take all the time you need. I'll sleep in the spare room, give you space." "No," she turned back to him. "Stay, but understand that right now I don't know what we are, if we're even still married in any way that matters." It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't an ending either. James would take what he could get. That night they lay in the same bed but with a chasm between them. James stared at the ceiling, listening to Emma's breathing, knowing she wasn't asleep despite her closed eyes. Both of them pretending, both of them lost in thoughts they couldn't share. And in the main house, papers were being drawn up. Edward Thornton contesting the will, claiming fraud, undue influence, mental incompetence. The first shots in a battle that would determine not just who owned the ranch, but what kind of man James would prove himself to be. The war had begun, and James had already lost the first and most important engagement. He'd won an empire, but shattered the trust of the woman he loved. Now he had to find a way to win her back while defending everything his father had built. The real test was just beginning. 2 weeks had passed since the will reading, 2 weeks during which Emma had barely spoken more than necessary words. She fulfilled her duties as wife in the mechanical sense. Meals prepared, cabin maintained, but the warmth that had been growing between them had frozen solid as Montana ice. James gave her space while simultaneously trying to show through actions, if not words, that his love hadn't been contingent on deception. He rose early to make coffee before she woke, left wildflowers on the table, took on extra chores she would normally handle, small gestures that she accepted with polite thanks, but no real softening. At night they lay side by side in the darkness, close enough to touch, but separated by an invisible wall neither knew how to breach. The ranch operations continued. Life didn't pause for personal crisis. James threw himself into work with an intensity that bordered on punishing. He was up before dawn working until darkness forced him inside. The physical exhaustion helped. When your body ached from honest labor, the emotional pain became almost bearable by comparison. Rodriguez noticed, of course. "Boss, you keep working like this, you'll break yourself. The ranch needs attention. The ranch needs its owner to not collapse from exhaustion." Rodriguez paused. "How's Mrs. Thornton?" James didn't answer, couldn't answer without his voice breaking. Rodriguez nodded understanding. Give her time. Women are stronger than we think, but they process things different. What we'd fight over and forget they need to work through. Sound advice from a man who'd been married 20 years. James hoped it was true. The legal notice arrived on November 26th. Edward Thornton, through his attorney Gerald Hutchinson, was officially contesting the will. The case would be heard in territorial court in Helena beginning January 15th. 2 months to prepare for a battle that would determine whether James kept his inheritance or lost everything his father had tried to give him. Samuel Price arrived at the ranch 3 days later, traveling from Helena with a leather case full of documents and the expression that suggested the fight ahead would be difficult. They met in the main house library, the same room where the will had been read. James felt like a trespasser here. This had been William's domain. The books, the desk, the chair all carried his father's presence. Sometimes James swore he could smell William's pipe tobacco, though the man had been dead nearly a month. Samuel spread papers across the desk. Edward's filing is aggressive but expected. He's claiming 4 things: mental incompetence due to illness, fraud in the paternity documentation, undue influence by you over a dying man, and finally, that illegitimate children have no standing under territorial law despite the statute allowing acknowledgement. Can he win? On the law, no. The statute is clear, the documentation's solid, the witnesses impeccable. But Edward's not really fighting on law. He's fighting on emotion and prejudice. Samuel leaned back. Judges are human. They have biases. The idea of an illegitimate son appearing from nowhere to claim a fortune, it plays into fears about social order, about protecting property rights. Edward will paint you as a charlatan and confidence man. So how do we counter that? By showing who you really are. Not just your blood connection to William, but your character, your competence. The man you've proven yourself to be in the month you worked as foreman. Samuel pulled out another document. We need testimony from the ranch workers, from townspeople, from anyone who can speak to your integrity and ability. And Emma, Samuel's expression softened. Her testimony would be powerful. A wife vouching for her husband's character carries weight, but I understand the situation is complicated. Complicated was an understatement. James had barely been able to get Emma to discuss what they'd have for dinner, let alone convince her to testify on his behalf in front of the entire territory. I'll ask her, James said, but I won't force it. Fair enough. Now let's discuss Edward's probable strategy. They spent 3 hours going over every angle, every potential line of attack, every weakness in James's position. By the time Samuel left, James's head was pounding and his stomach twisted with anxiety. The trial was still 6 weeks away, but already it dominated every thought. He returned to the cabin as twilight turned the sky purple and gold. Inside, Emma had prepared dinner. Venison stew from a deer one of the ranch hands had brought down, fresh bread, coffee that filled the small space with its rich aroma. They ate in silence as had become their pattern. But tonight, James couldn't bear it anymore. Emma, I need to talk to you about something. She looked up, wariness in her eyes. The trial starts in January. Edward is contesting the will. My lawyer says it will help if you testify, about my character, about the kind of man I've been since we married. James set down his fork. But I won't ask you to do that if you can't, if you're too angry, if standing up there and vouching for me feels like another betrayal. Emma was quiet for a long time. She pushed food around her plate without eating, thinking. What happens if you lose? She asked finally. We lose everything. The ranch, the money, all of it. We'd have to start over with nothing. And if I don't testify, does that make you lose? I don't know. Maybe. Probably not by itself, but it wouldn't help. Emma stood, moving to the window. The same spot she'd occupied 2 weeks ago when deciding whether to stay or leave. James waited, barely breathing. I'm still angry, she said, still hurt, still trying to understand how the man I thought I married could keep such enormous secrets. I know. But... She turned to face him. I've also been thinking about everything that's happened, about the man you've been since William died. You could have ignored me, told me I had no right to be angry since I was now rich. Reminded me that without you I'd still be hauling water buckets and sleeping in that shack. I would never. I know, that's my point. Emma moved back to the table but didn't sit. You've given me space, respected my anger, kept every promise you made except the one about complete honesty. And that promise you broke before we married when you were still figuring out who you were and what you wanted. James felt something loosen in his chest. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but a crack in the ice. I'll testify, Emma said. Not because I've forgiven you completely, but because despite the secrets, despite the lies of omission, I believe you're a good man who made a mistake. And good men deserve second chances. Thank you. The words felt inadequate. Emma, don't. She held up a hand. Don't make promises right now. Don't tell me it will all be fine. Just show me. Through your actions, through how you handled the trial and everything after, show me that the man I fell in love with is real, even if his name was wrong. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was more than James had dared hope for. He nodded, accepting the terms she'd set. They finished dinner in silence that felt less hostile than before. And that night when they lay down to sleep, Emma's hand found his across the space between them. She didn't move closer, didn't speak, but her fingers laced through his and held on. It was a start. The weeks before the trial passed in a blur of preparation. Samuel returned twice more, each time drilling James on testimony, on how to respond to hostile questions, on maintaining composure under pressure. They rehearsed Emma's testimony too, though she needed less coaching than James expected. She had a natural directness that would serve her well on the stand. Christmas came and went with little celebration. The ranch continued its operations, cattle needing care regardless of holidays. But on Christmas morning, James woke to find Emma had made his favorite breakfast, eggs and bacon biscuits with honey coffee strong enough to strip paint. And on the table, wrapped in brown paper, a small gift. Inside was a photograph. James and Emma on their wedding day, captured by the traveling photographer who'd happened through Pine Ridge that week. In the image they stood side by side, Emma in her altered dress, James in his wedding suit. Both looked young and hopeful and slightly terrified. So we remember, Emma said quietly, what we were building before everything got complicated. James set the photograph on the shelf above the bed. A reminder of promises made even if the path to keeping them had become treacherous. January arrived with bitter cold and snow that turned the ranch into a landscape of white on white. The trial date approached like an inevitable reckoning. James, Emma, and Samuel made the journey to Helena in a wagon fitted with runners for snow travel, bundled under blankets and moving at a pace that gave James too much time to think. Helena was the territorial capital, a city that had grown rich on gold and copper mining. The courthouse dominated the main square, 3 stories of stone that proclaimed the permanence of law in a land still half wild. Inside hallways echoed with boot steps and legal arguments. The smell of tobacco and old wood permeated everything. The courtroom on the 3rd floor could seat perhaps 100 people. On January 15th, every seat was filled. News of the case had spread across the territory. Illegitimate son inheriting a fortune. Established heir fighting back. It had all the elements of drama that drew crowds like moths to flame. Judge Robert Mitchell presided, 60 years old and carrying a reputation for fairness tempered with conservatism. He'd been one of the witnesses to William's paternity acknowledgement, which Edward had tried to use as grounds for recusal. Mitchell had refused, noting that being a witness didn't bias him toward any particular outcome, only toward truth. Edward sat at the plaintiff's table with Gerald Hutchinson, looking confident and expensive in tailored suits. He'd brought supporters, business associates from San Francisco, who lent an air of Eastern sophistication to his side of the courtroom. James sat with Samuel and Emma at the defense table, acutely aware that every eye in the room was evaluating him, judging whether he looked like William Thornton's son, whether he seemed like a charlatan or an honest man wronged. The weight of those stares felt physical. Mitchell called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. We are convened to hear the case of Edward Thornton versus the estate of William Thornton. Mr. Hutchinson, you may present your opening statement. Gerald Hutchinson stood, and James got his first real look at the man who would try to destroy him. Late 40s, sharp-featured with the kind of confidence that came from winning more cases than he lost. He addressed the courtroom like an actor on a stage voice carrying to the back rows. Your Honor, gentlemen of the court, this case presents a simple question. Should a lifetime of legitimate family bonds be overturned by convenient evidence produced at the last possible moment, William Thornton built his empire over 40 years. In all that time, he never once acknowledged having a son. Then, in his final months, weakened by illness and facing death, a stranger appears. This stranger produces documents that could easily be forged, tells a tragic story designed to manipulate an old man's guilt, and within weeks of William's death walks away with $150,000. Hutchinson paused, letting that number sink in. James Crawford, or Thornton as he now calls himself, asks this court to believe that William Thornton abandoned a woman and child for 35 years, then suddenly developed a conscience. That seems unlikely at best, fraudulent at worst. We will prove that William was not of sound mind in his final months, that the so-called evidence is fabricated or misrepresented, that undue influence was applied to a dying man who couldn't resist, and that Edward Thornton Williams' legitimate cousin and closest living relative is the rightful heir to the estate. He sat down to murmurs of approval from his section of the courtroom. Samuel stood moving to the center of the room with quiet authority. Where Hutchinson had been theatrical, Samuel was conversational, speaking to the judge as one reasonable man to another. Your Honor, the opposition would have you believe this is a complicated case requiring deep investigation into motives and authenticity. It is not. The facts are simple and documented. William Thornton had a relationship with Elizabeth Hayes in 1849. She became pregnant. Rather than face his family's disapproval, William sent her away with money and broken promises. Elizabeth raised their son alone for 35 years, keeping every scrap of evidence of their relationship. Samuel gestured to the defense table where documents were stacked. When Elizabeth died, she asked her son to find his father, not for money, though God knows they could have used it, but for closure, for truth. James came to Montana, presented his evidence to William, and William recognized the son he'd abandoned. More than that, William saw in James the kind of man he wished he'd been, competent, honest, worthy of building on the foundation William had created. Samuel's voice hardened slightly. Edward Thornton had 30 years to build a relationship with his cousin. He couldn't be bothered, not until the scent of inheritance brought him running. We will prove that William was of completely sound mind, that the evidence is genuine and verified, that James earned William's respect through character, not manipulation, and that a father has every right to acknowledge his son and make amends for past wrongs, even if that acknowledgement comes late. The trial proper began with Hutchinson calling his first witness, Dr. Harrison Williams' physician. Doctor, you treated William Thornton in his final months. Please describe his condition. Dr. Harrison, clearly uncomfortable, answered carefully. William suffered from severe heart disease. The pain was considerable. I prescribed laudanum to manage it. Laudanum, an opium derivative, which causes what affects pain relief primarily. But in large doses it can cause confusion, altered mental states. Was William taking large doses? Moderate doses, more than I would have liked, but his pain was severe. In your medical opinion, could these doses have impaired his judgment? Dr. Harrison hesitated. Possibly, but— Thank you, doctor. No further questions. Samuel stood for cross-examination. Dr. Harrison, when William signed his will on May 1st of last year, 6 months before his death, was he taking laudanum? No. His condition hadn't deteriorated to that point yet. So, on the day he acknowledged James as his son, the day he signed legal documents with 3 witnesses present, William was completely unmedicated and lucid. Yes. And in your professional opinion, was there any sign of mental incompetence on that date? None whatsoever. William was sharp as ever. Thank you, doctor. The testimony continued. Hutchinson called character witnesses who painted William as a practical man who would never have acknowledged an illegitimate child, who questioned the timing of James's appearance, who suggested that a dying man's judgment couldn't be trusted, medication or not. But each time Samuel's cross-examination revealed weaknesses. The witnesses hadn't seen William in years, didn't know about his relationship with Elizabeth, were speculating rather than speaking from direct knowledge. By the afternoon of the second day, Hutchinson's case was looking shakier than he'd probably hoped. Then Edward himself took the stand. Under direct examination, Edward presented himself as the wronged party, a devoted cousin who'd maintained business relationships with William, who'd expected naturally to inherit from a man with no other heirs, who'd been blindsided by this claim from a stranger. "I loved William," Edward said, and even managed to make it sound sincere. "When I learned of his illness, I came immediately, only to find that this person had already inserted himself into William's household, had isolated him from family, had convinced him to sign away everything to someone we'd never even heard of." Samuel's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Thornton, when did you last visit William before learning of his illness?" "I'm not certain of the exact date. Several years, perhaps. 3 years, 2 months to be precise, during which time you sent exactly 2 letters. Does that sound like a devoted cousin?" Edward flushed. "I had business obligations in San Francisco. Speaking of business, how much money have you borrowed against the expectation of inheriting the ranch?" "I don't see how that's relevant." "Answer the question, Mr. Thornton," Judge Mitchell said mildly. "Some, for investment purposes." Samuel produced a document. $35,000 from 3 San Francisco banks using future inheritance of Thornton Ranch as collateral. You weren't concerned about William's health. You were worried about your debts. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Edward's face went from red to purple. "That's a distortion of no further questions." The prosecution rested its case on the morning of the 3rd day. Now it was Samuel's turn to present evidence for the defense. He began with the documents themselves. Birth certificate laid out for the judge's inspection. Letters from Elizabeth, her handwriting verified by a San Francisco expert who'd examined known samples. Photographs showing the unmistakable resemblance between young William and adult James. Then came the witnesses to William's paternity acknowledgement. First the banker who'd served as notary. Then Judge Mitchell himself stepping down from the bench to testify about William's clear competence and firm resolve on the day the documents were signed. Finally, on the afternoon of the 4th day, James himself took the stand. The courtroom packed even tighter if that was possible. Everyone wanted to see the alleged bastard son defend his claim. Samuel led him through the story gently. Elizabeth's life in Colorado, the poverty and struggle, her deathbed request, James's journey to Montana, the meeting with William. "Why didn't you reveal yourself immediately?" Samuel asked. "Because I wanted to earn my place through competence, not blood. I made my father a deal. I'd work as foreman under an assumed name. If I proved capable of running the ranch, then I deserved to inherit it. If I couldn't, then blood alone shouldn't be enough." "And did you prove capable?" "I believe so. The ranch turned a profit under my management. The workers respected me. The operations ran smoothly." "Tell the court about your relationship with William in those final months." James's voice roughened. "We talked. About his life, my mother's life, the choices that led us to that point. I learned that he'd tried to find her, that he'd never stopped loving her, that abandoning us was the great regret of his life. In the end, we had 1 month together. It wasn't enough, but it was more than either of us had expected." Hutchinson's cross-examination was aggressive, designed to rattle James. "Let's talk about your convenient marriage. You met Emma Hartwell while hiding your true identity, correct?" "I was working as foreman under the name I'd used for years, deceiving her. I wasn't ready to reveal the truth yet. Not to her, not to anyone." "How fortunate for her that you revealed it after William's death, making her a wealthy woman." James's hands clenched on the witness stand rail. "I married Emma because I loved her, because she was kind and strong and deserved better than what life had given her. The inheritance had nothing to do with it. Really? You're claiming you married a poor woman out of pure love? Hutchinson's tone dripped skepticism. I married her when I was a foreman making $80 a month. Yes, I knew I'd eventually inherit. But she didn't. She married me thinking I was poor. She's still here after learning the truth. That should tell you something about her character and mine. Or it tells us she's willing to overlook deception for money. Object. Samuel started, but James cut him off. Emma Hartwell is the most honest person in this courtroom. She deserves respect, not your insinuations. Judge Mitchell intervened. Mr. Hutchinson, save the character assassination for your closing arguments. Mr. Thornton, compose yourself. When James stepped down, his hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the effort of maintaining control when every instinct screamed to defend Emma more forcefully. Emma was the last witness Samuel called. She walked to the stand with her head high, wearing her best dress, the one she'd been married in. Every eye in the courtroom followed her. Samuel's questioning was gentle, designed to let Emma tell her story in her own words. Mrs. Thornton, please tell the court how you met your husband. Emma's voice was steady, clear. I was carrying water, 2 heavy buckets long walk. My hands were bleeding. A stranger stopped to help. He didn't have to. Most people wouldn't have. But he did. And that stranger was James? Yes, but I knew him as James Crawford, a new foreman at the ranch. What was your impression of him? That he was kind, respectful, different from any man I'd met. He helped without expecting anything in return. Over the next weeks he continued helping, fixed things around my family's cabin, taught me to read, treated me like I mattered. When did you learn his true identity? Emma's expression tightened. At the will reading, same as everyone else. How did that make you feel? Angry, betrayed, like everything I thought I knew was a lie. She paused. But then I thought about the man he'd been every day since we married. Patient, hard-working, honest in every way except that one enormous secret. And I realized that the core of who he was hadn't changed. The name was wrong, but the man was real. Hutchinson stood for cross-examination like a predator sensing weakness. Mrs. Thornton, you went from crushing poverty to great wealth overnight. Quite an improvement. Material wealth, yes. Must be nice going from hauling water to commanding servants. We don't have servants. I still cook and clean our cabin myself. Hutchinson looked surprised. Why, you can afford help now. Because honest work has value regardless of bank accounts. Because I'm not ashamed of the life I came from. And because the most important thing my husband gave me wasn't money. It was dignity. The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Before I married James, people treated me like I was worthless. My own family, the town, everyone. Then one man looked at me and saw value. Not when he was rich. When he was supposedly a poor foreman earning $80 a month. If this court takes away the money, the ranch, all of it, will survive. But what you can't take away is the fact that someone finally saw me as worthy of respect. That's the real inheritance. Hutchinson tried to recover. Very touching. But how do we know any of this is real, that you aren't simply an opportunist willing to overlook deception for fortune? Emma looked directly at him. Because I'm still angry about the secrets. I haven't fully forgiven him. But I'm here testifying because I believe in second chances. I believe good men can make mistakes and still be good men. My husband made a mistake. He's spending every day trying to make it right. That seems worth supporting. When Emma stepped down, there were tears in more than one spectator's eyes. Even Judge Mitchell had to clear his throat before calling for closing arguments. Hutchinson went first, summarizing his case with passion, if not persuasiveness. William had been incompetent, the evidence questionable, James an opportunist, Edward the rightful heir. Standard arguments well delivered but lacking the weight of truth. Samuel's closing was simpler. Your Honor, this case comes down to a single question. Does a father have the right to acknowledge his son? Montana law says yes. The evidence proves paternity beyond doubt. The witnesses confirm William's mental competence. Everything else is noise designed to obscure simple truth. James Thornton is William's son. William acknowledged him freely and legally. The will should stand. Judge Mitchell took less time to deliberate than expected. Court reconvened after only an hour's recess. "This court has examined the evidence and testimony carefully," Mitchell said. "The documentation proving James Thornton's paternity is thorough and verified. The witnesses to William Thornton's acknowledgment are beyond reproach. William's mental competency at the time of signing is well established." He paused, and James felt Emma's hand find his under the table. Montana territorial law of 1884 explicitly permits fathers to acknowledge children born outside marriage and provide for them. The law is clear. The evidence is conclusive. The will of William Thornton is hereby upheld in its entirety. Edward Thornton's contest is dismissed. The gavel fell like a thunderclap. James sat frozen, barely able to process the words. They'd won. The ranch was his. Everything William had built, everything he'd tried to give it, was now officially, legally James's. Edward stormed from the courtroom, Hutchinson trailing behind. Supporters congratulated James and Emma. Reporters shouted questions. Samuel smiled with quiet satisfaction. But Judge Mitchell wasn't finished. "However," he said, cutting through the noise, "this court wishes to make a recommendation. While the law favors James Thornton, equity suggests that Edward Thornton, as William's cousin and someone who maintained family ties for decades, deserves consideration beyond the $5,000 specified in the will. This court recommends, though, cannot enforce that James consider offering a more generous settlement, say $15,000, to avoid future conflict and honor family bonds." The courtroom quieted. Everyone looked at James. This was a test, not legal but moral. Would he be generous to the man who'd tried to destroy him, or would he take the harder road of justified vengeance? James thought of William's deathbed words, about choosing to be better than the men who'd wronged you, about building something worth passing down. He stood. "Your Honor, I'll do more than recommend. I'll offer Edward Thornton $20,000, 4 times what the will specified, on one condition. He accepts it in full settlement, leaves Montana, and never contests this inheritance again." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. $20,000 was a fortune in its own right, enough to start over anywhere, build a new life. Outside the courtroom, Edward's lawyer found Samuel. The offer was accepted within an hour. Edward took his money and disappeared west toward California. James never saw him again. The journey back to Pine Ridge took 3 days through winter weather, but the wagon felt warmer on the return trip. Emma sat closer to James, the ice between them finally beginning to thaw. "You didn't have to offer him so much," she said on the second night, as they camped under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "I wanted to. My father spent his life holding grudges and living with regret. I'd rather choose generosity and sleep well." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm proud of you, for how you handled the trial, for what you offered Edward, for becoming the kind of man your mother raised you to be." It was the first real praise she'd given since learning the truth. James felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for weeks. "Does this mean you've forgiven me?" "It means I'm working on it, that I see who you are beneath the mistakes, that I want to try to rebuild what we started." She looked at him in the firelight. "But James, no more secrets, ever. If we're going to make this work, I need complete honesty, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." "I promise, no more secrets." She leaned against his shoulder, and James wrapped his arm around her. Above them, the Montana sky wheeled in ancient patterns. Around them, the land stretched vast and empty and full of possibility. They'd won the legal battle. Now came the harder work of building something that would last. Spring of 1886 brought new beginnings. The ranch emerged from winter with James and Emma fully established as its masters. The transition wasn't without challenges. Some workers questioned taking orders from a 35-year-old who'd been foreman just months before. Some neighbors whispered about illegitimate heirs and improper inheritance. But James proved himself through consistent competence. He increased wages 10%, earning loyalty from workers who'd been underpaid for years. He built better housing for the hands, replacing leaking shacks with solid cabins. He established a school for workers' children, hiring a teacher from Helena at his own expense. Emma found her role too. She started a literacy program for adults, teaching evening classes in reading and arithmetic. She formed a women's cooperative where ranch wives could sell preserves, baked goods, and handiwork, keeping the profits for themselves rather than turning everything over to husbands. The changes rippled through the territory. Other ranchers grumbled that James was spoiling workers, setting dangerous precedents about wages and conditions. But ranch productivity increased. Workers stayed loyal. The Thornton brand became known for quality cattle and ethical operation. By 1890, the ranch had expanded to 60,000 acres through purchase of failing neighboring properties. The herd numbered 6,800 head. Annual profits exceeded William's best years. James had proven that treating people well and running a business successfully weren't mutually exclusive. But the true test of character came in the spring of 1900 when drought turned the Montana grasslands to dust. James watched the sky day after day, praying for rain that didn't come. The creek that fed the ranch slowed to a trickle. Pastures turned brown. Cattle grew gaunt ribs showing through hide. Across the territory, smaller ranchers faced ruin. In the town council meeting that May, the desperation was palpable. Cornelius Drake, the neighbor who'd once hired rustlers, stood before the assembly with hat literally in hand. "I've lost 200 head to starvation," Drake said, voice breaking. "I can't afford feed. The bank won't extend more credit. By fall, I'll have nothing left." Other small ranchers told similar stories, bankruptcy looming, families facing loss of everything they'd built. The banker in attendance shook his head sadly. Too much risk. No more loans. All eyes turned to James. He was the only one with resources deep enough to help. But he had no obligation. These were competitors. Some, like Drake, had actively worked against him. The smart business decision would be to let them fail, buy their land cheap when foreclosure came, expand the Thornton empire on the backs of others' misfortune. James thought about the man he'd become over the past 15 years, the lessons learned from William's deathbed confessions, the values Elizabeth had instilled, the kind of legacy he wanted to leave for his children. William and Elizabeth, his 3 children, sat in the back of the room, watching, learning what kind of man their father would choose to be when faced with power. James stood. "I'll provide feed from my reserves at cost, no markup, for any rancher who needs it. If you can't pay now, I'll extend interest-free credit until next season when cattle can be sold. If you still can't recover, I'll buy your cattle at fair market value, not drought prices, what they'd be worth in a normal year." The silence that followed was profound. Then Drake, proud man that he was, started to cry. Others joined him. The banker looked stunned. "Why?" someone asked. "After everything, why help us?" James looked at his children, at Emma, who nodded encouragement, at the community that had scorned his mother and questioned his legitimacy but was now his to shape. "Because I want my children to understand that strength isn't crushing those weaker than you. It's lifting them up. My father learned that too late. I won't make his mistake." The cost was significant. $8,000 in feed and credit extended. But every rancher survived. Every family kept their land. And the community bonds forged that summer proved stronger than any business contract. Years later, when James needed support for conservation initiatives, those same ranchers stood with him. When drought came again in 1907, they helped each other without needing to be asked. The investment in compassion paid dividends no ledger could calculate. But the full value of that decision wouldn't be clear until a cold October afternoon in 1918 when James sat in his library telling the story to a grandson who needed to understand what legacy really meant. Robert had listened to the entire tale without interruption. Hours had passed. The whiskey bottle stood half empty. Outside, the ranch continued its eternal rhythms. "So you built all this from a secret," Robert said finally. "Not just from a secret. From redemption, from choosing to be better than the man my father had been, from learning that true wealth isn't land or money, It's the values you pass down. James stood, joints creaking with age, moved to the window where he could see the empire he'd built and maintained for 33 years. This ranch, Robert, 60,000 acres, 8,000 cattle, 200,000 in assets, it will be yours someday. Sooner rather than later, I expect. An old man knows when his time is approaching. He turned back to his grandson. But here's what I need you to understand. The question isn't whether you'll be rich or poor. It's what kind of man you'll be. Will you use power to build or destroy, to lift people up or crush them, to honor the sacrifices of those who came before, or squander their gifts? Robert stood moving to join his grandfather at the window. I want to be like you. Then remember this. Legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you choose to build. Your great-grandmother Elizabeth raised me in poverty, but gave me values money couldn't buy. My father William gave me wealth, but only after learning that some prices are too high to pay. And your grandmother Emma taught me that honest work and honest love matter more than any fortune. James placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. You fought in the war. You've seen the worst humanity can do. Now you have the chance to show the best. This ranch is your tool. Use it to make the world a little better than you found it. That's the only inheritance that matters. Through the window, the Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The same view William had watched decades ago. The same land Elizabeth had never seen but helped her son claim. The same legacy that would pass from James to Robert to generations yet unborn. They laughed when Emma married a simple mountain man, James said quietly. But I wasn't simple, and she wasn't finished becoming who she was meant to be. We built something bigger than ourselves, not because we were special, but because we chose every day to be better than we had to be. He looked at his grandson with eyes that had seen triumph and tragedy, wealth and want, love and loss. That's the real legacy, Robert. Not what you take, but what you give. Not what you inherit, but what you build. Remember that, and the ranch will thrive for another 100 years. Robert nodded, understanding settling on him like a mantle of responsibility. Below them, ranch lights flickered on as evening fell. Workers heading to dinner, families gathering in warm homes, cattle settling for the night. The eternal rhythms of a working operation that had survived drought and depression, rustlers and legal battles, secrets and redemption. All of it built on a foundation of one man's choice to be better than his father, to transform shame into legacy, to prove that what we inherit matters less than what we become. The library door opened. A young woman entered. Robert's sister come to call them for dinner. Grandfather, father says if you don't come now, the food will get cold. James smiled. William, his eldest son, named for the father who'd tried to make amends. Running the ranch operations now while James moved into advisory roles. Another link in the chain stretching back to Elizabeth Hayes and forward to grandchildren not yet born. We're coming, James said. He took one last look at the photograph on his desk. Emma on their wedding day, young and hopeful. She'd passed 3 years ago peacefully in her sleep at age 57. 30 years of marriage that had weathered storms and built something lasting. I kept my promise, James whispered to the photograph. No more secrets, just truth and work and love. I hope that was enough. He turned from the window, from the past, from the regrets and triumphs that had shaped his life. The future walked ahead of him in the form of his grandson. The present awaited in a dining room full of family. Behind him, the Montana sky turned dark and stars emerged. The same stars that had watched Elizabeth raise a child alone. The same stars that had seen William die with redemption in his heart. The same stars that would shine on Thornton Ranch long after everyone currently alive had turned to dust. But the legacy would remain. Not in land or money or power. In choices made. In kindness given, in the quiet determination to be better than circumstances demanded, to lift rather than crush, to build rather than destroy, to transform inheritance into legacy. That was the story James had needed to tell, the truth his grandson needed to hear. And as he walked toward the dining room, toward family and warmth, and the continuation of all he'd built, James William Thornton felt at peace. The empire was secure, the legacy established, the future assured, not through wealth, through character.